Hey, thanks for watching my video. Today we are going to replace the stator in a Ducati motorcycle. This is going to be on a 2008 Ducati 848 Superbike. It is almost the same on every Ducati, the 848, the 1098, the 1198. Monsters minus the liquid cooled, the air cooled ones, same thing. Just pull off the stator cover. You just don't have to deal with coolant on your air cooled bikes. But the stator cover on a Ducati is pretty much the same on every Ducati that you're going to work on. You do need one special tool, and that is the Ducati stator cover removal tool. I will post a link to a company on eBay where you can get one for a few dollars. It's a lot cheaper than going to the Ducati dealership and buying a Ducati, the actual Ducati manufactured tool. It's pretty much the same premise. It's just a like a pulley puller. It just pulls that cover off the side of the bike. When you're doing this, I will advise that you drain the radiator fluid, get all your coolant out of the bike, and drain the oil. For me, I was kicking it around, leaving the oil in, taking the oil out. I've done this a few times on bikes. This bike is actually my bike. It has 65,000 miles on it. But at the last minute, before I pulled the stator cover off, I went ahead and I drained the oil instead of having a small puddle of oil on my garage floor. I figured, the bike's got 65,000 miles on it. It is due for an oil change at 66,000 miles. I change my oil every 3,000 miles. And that's the way I do it, is I do it. So like 66 would be a 3,000 mile oil interchange. But at 65,000 miles, my stator did go. So I'm going to ride it for 1,000 miles with new oil. And then at 66,000, I'm going to go ahead and put new oil and an oil filter on the bike. Show the bike a little bit of love. What's $20 worth of oil when you're this deep into a maintenance, right? So as you're watching this video, you're watching me pull away all the coolant lines, and I drained the coolant a couple days ago, so to make sure that all the coolant was out of the system and away from anywhere that I would be working. You do want to remove your clutch slave. You want to just put it up out of the way. Typically what I do is just zip tie the parts out of the way so they're not bouncing around. Because the bike does have 65,000 miles on it, I went ahead and I pulled off my right clip-on, my right rear set. Sorry, clip-on's a handlebar. My right rear set, I pulled that off and scrubbed it down and cleaned it up so it looks like it belongs on a Ducati. Doesn't look all worn out and like it has 65,000 miles on it any longer. So right now I'm just zip tying the slave up to the frame just to get it out of the way. When I did pull off the left rear set, I went ahead or you have to pull it off anyway. You have to remove the shifter linkage, and it's almost easier to remove that rear set and remove the shifter linkage at the same time as one unit. When you do this, make sure you take like a Sharpie and mark the spline, mark the shaft on the shifter shaft, mark it to where the clamp part of your shifter linkage is. That way when you put your bike back together, you can just line that up with the correct spline, and you don't have to change anything on your shifter. And when you put your rear set back on, make sure you put your rear set on with red Loctite. Don't use blue Loctite, use red Loctite. Very important. It'll keep your rear set bolts from backing out. And all your buddies are going to tell you once you put red Loctite on, you'll never get the bolt out. Well, your buddies are liars. Use the red Loctite. It'll be a little bit tighter getting those bolts off the bike next time, but you'll thank yourself if you don't lose one of the bolts. You'll appreciate it. I also, during this project, I also removed my side stand and cleaned my side stand bracket up and my side stand up. Springs all clean now. And I went ahead and put that back together with red Loctite. And I was impressed to see that when Ducati built the bike, they used red Loctite to install the side stand. In the past, a lot of Ducati owners would complain that they lost a side stand bolt here and there. So yeah, Ducati did put red Loctite on my bike. I would assume that you have red Loctite on your bike as well. If not red Loctite, maybe at least blue Loctite. But there should be some kind of Loctite holding that side stand on, along with Loctite holding your rear set on. So as I'm loosening the bolts which hold the stator cover on, some coolant is leaking out of one of the hoses. So I just put a paper towel down to help catch some of that fluid that's leaking out. This job really isn't a messy job, but yeah, you do have the possibility of getting some fluids on the floor. And again, if you drain the oil out early, then you don't have to do it while you're doing the stator cover. There is going to be some oil that seeps out of the stator cover when you have it off. You'll see it coming out of the magneto, whatever they call that, the kind of flywheel magneto-y looking thing that's inside that spins around the stator. And there is a oil hole in the bottom of the case that does allow engine oil into the stator area to keep that lubed up for you. Now the reason we're doing this today is I went for a ride and I was having some electrical issues on that ride, and when I got to my destination, the bike wouldn't restart. It wouldn't start back up. I fiddled with it a little bit, turned the key off, turned the key on, turned the key off, turned the key on. It finally did turn over, which I was lucky. It was showing 11.3 volts. That is not good. I knew there was definitely an electrical problem with 11.3 volts. You should have somewhere around 14.4 volts coming off your charging system. Since I've replaced my stator and my regulator, I'm getting a solid 14.4 volts. At high revs, it does jump to 14.5 volts, but it immediately, I only see the 14.5 volts for a split second, and it immediately adjusts itself and goes back down to 14.4 volts. I'm pulling 14.4 volts at an idle. I'm pulling 14.4 volts at 9,000 RPMs. So I'm really happy with this. I hope I get another 65,000 miles out of this stator and regulator. I'm going to say my regulator was replaced under a recall back in 2008. So it isn't the original regulator rectifier. It was replaced during this recall, under warranty of course, or recall policy, whatever. So yeah, this did last me, and this is actually a known issue. I'm going to show you the connectors in a little bit, but it's a known issue with Ducatis. It's really not a problem with the regulator or the stator. I would imagine that the stator that I'm pulling out of this bike right now works properly, but it's more a problem with the connection that the stator makes between the stator and the regulator. That connection gets dirty, it gets contaminated, and it doesn't make a good connection. After a little while, I don't know how long, some of the stuff I've read on the internet, guys have had problems with the connector early on. This is 2021 and the bike's a 2008, so I'm lucky I got a good 13 years out of my connector. But again, my bike does not sit outside ever. It's only been in the rain a handful of times, and that's only by accident because I came around a mountain and it's pouring down rain and there's nowhere to go except straight on. So yeah, you typically, if you're inspecting your bike, the connector between the stator and the regulator is one of those areas you really need to inspect. You probably should disconnect that connector and look in and make sure it's not burnt. Maybe put some dielectric grease on those connectors. That way you get a good connection, electrical connection between the two wires. And if any moisture gets in there, it'll slow the corrosion. With as much voltage that your stator is creating, it's going to be hard to not burn it out. It's making tons of voltage, like like an arc welder would create, just thousands of volts coming off this stator, and then that regulator is getting it down to the 14 volts DC that your bike needs to run on. So don't think that your stator's just busting out 12 volts as you're going down the road. It is not. It's creating a lot of voltage. Remember, voltage doesn't kill you, it's the amps that kill you. So 12 volts, 5 amps is not going to hurt you. It's going to tingle a little bit, but it's really not going to hurt you like going in your house and sticking your finger in the light socket. Your motorcycle's not going to hurt you like the light socket will with alternating current. Anyway, so here's where I'm at, where I'm dropping out the oil out of the bottom of the engine. And this oil actually doesn't look real bad. It's only got 2,000 miles on it. I religiously change my oil on all of my motorcycles every 3,000 miles. And this oil was changed at 63,000 miles, which wasn't too long ago. I don't ride this bike as often as I used to, and I really haven't been riding this bike a lot in 2021. I did buy a Monster M1100, and I've been spending a lot of time on that Monster. It's just if you've never ridden a Monster, if you've always ridden a Superbike, I suggest that you spend some time on a Monster and try it out. So here's the tool that's going to remove your stator cover. And like I said, it's just a pulley puller. It's nothing really fancy. It's 2 screws that screw into the stator cover, and then just like a press. So what I'm spinning right now would be the press part of it, and it pushes up against your crankshaft and slides that stator cover off of the bike. When you attach this and you start turning that handle, if your stator cover doesn't release itself from the crankcase freely, doesn't just pop off, there is silicone holding the stator cover on to help seal it, because there is no gasket between the crankcase and the stator cover. So Ducati did put a light coat of sealant, and I will be putting a light coat of sealant. You'll watch me do this in the install portion. But when you're tightening this down, if your stator cover is not coming off freely, take a deep breath, back away from the bike, go get a Coke, come back and look all the way around the stator cover. Make sure you don't miss one of those screws. The last thing you want to do is pry your stator cover off of the bike. Do not ever pry on your stator cover, beat on your stator cover with a hammer. Be gentle with your stator cover. If you think I'm joking about this, jump on eBay and look at what a used stator cover goes for. You're going to be out about $300 for a used stator cover, and you're probably going to be out $1,000 if you think you want a brand new stator cover. So be careful. Do not force this. Nothing good comes from forcing your stator cover. If you can't get it off with just your hands, just stop and take a break. It's time for a break. You need a breather. If you smoke, go smoke a cigarette. Take more years off your life. If you're smoking, you're too dumb to be with us. You're just wasting our oxygen anyway. So just take a break, get away from your bike, come back, deal with it. But be gentle with your stator cover. You do not want to damage your stator cover, and it's easily done. So be careful with it. So you see me just wiggling my stator cover. It's going to come off. I'm not fighting it hard. You're not going to see me get a hammer and beat my stator cover. Sometimes it's a great idea to back the press back in, push your stator cover back onto the bike, and try again. Relieve some tension. Something's going to be hung up somewhere. It could be your shifter, your shifter shaft. Just little things. You just don't want to force it. So I just let all the pressure off of it, and you can see it's wiggling. It wants to come off. And here it comes. It's coming. So there's your stator cover off the bike. There's your stator. You see that there's no wire. So that was my problem, is that connector was bad, and it actually burnt the wire from the connector all the way to the stator cover. So now that we've got the stator cover on the ground, you can do this on your workbench as well, but I went ahead and just threw a towel on the ground next to me, and I'm going to remove the 4 bolts that hold the stator wire into place. So there's 2 little brackets inside the stator cover, and they have 5mm hex head screws which hold it to the stator cover, and you want to make sure that you put those screws back in place. We don't want to lose those. So then we take those screws off, and once those screws are out of the way, there's the little cover that holds it on. And I apologize, I said 4 screws. It's only 2. And then we're going to loosen the 3 screws which hold the stator onto the cover. So just do a couple turns on each one of the screws. You don't have to back them all out at one time, but if you go around and you do a few turns on each one, and another trick Ducati probably doesn't want you to know about is most of the Ducati stators and regulators are interchangeable. There's not a whole lot of difference between stator and regulator from bike to bike. I'm going to say that the stator I'm going to put into this bike came off of an 1198, which again, 1198, 1098, and 848 are very, very similar bikes. So there's not a whole lot of difference. The Regulator does have the same part number as the 848. And I do buy used. I went on eBay. A lot of the recyclers on eBay will post up the mileage of the bike that the part came off of, which is really cool. So this came off of a low mileage 1198. I do have another one. Right after I finished this project, I went out on eBay and I bought another one. I got a great deal on a Regulator and Stator set off of a Ducati ST3. Again, the parts are almost identical. The only difference is the wire for the Stator going to the Regulator is about 2 feet long. So the Regulator on the ST3 is going to be under the seat or under the gas tank somewhere. So the wire is going to be longer. If I have to use it on my 848, I'm just going to zip tie the wire underneath the bike and call it good. But for under $100, you should be able to buy a used Regulator and Stator matching parts off of a bike that's been totaled. So here's some pictures I've taken. This is the Stator cover off. This is a poor picture of the connector that was burnt. This is going to be the connector coming off the Regulator that's burnt. This is the new connector off the Regulator. And then this is my old Stator, and you can see where the wire is burnt right into the case. So now we're going to start with the install. If you've watched this much of the video, we're 20 minutes in right now. And this is probably the worst part of your life was watching this video. But I appreciate you watching it. Now we're going to put the bike back together. Alright, so now we are putting the Stator back into the Stator cover. This is my new used Stator. I want to say that I bought this Stator on eBay and it was roughly about $60 and another $30 for the Regulator. I like buying used OEM. There's a huge savings when you do it that way. Typically you can get both of these for under $100. So we're just tightening down the 3 bolts that hold the Stator onto the cover. And if anything, this job is really easy to do. It's just very time consuming. So much of the bike has to come off for you to get to this point. I understand why dealerships charge so much money. It's too bad they charge so much money for the parts. Once they've got you for the labor, then they kill you on parts also. So now we've got these 3 bolts tightened down. Don't over tighten these. I didn't use a manual, but I'm sure there's torque specs for those bolts, and it's not going to be a lot of torque. I would guess probably 10 pounds at the most, 10 pounds, if not, inch pounds. It's probably 160 inch pounds or something like that to tighten those 3 bolts down. So now we're doing the 2 bolts which hold the little safety wire harness. So this is kind of a guide for the wire that comes off the Stator to protect it. So we're putting this little protective cover over the wire, and we're tightening down the screws that hold it into place. And again, these bolts don't have to be super tight, just snug. You are not going to tighten these bolts down as tight as you can possibly get them. The stator cover is aluminum, so let's, be cautious not to strip out anything on the stator cover. We do not want to buy a new one of these. All right, so our stator's in. We're good to go. Now we need to get the old sealant that Ducati used when they manufactured the bike. They put a light coat of sealant around the edge. So you see the wire, there's my old stator. You see where the wire is burnt there. I don't know what gave me the idea to go ahead and show you this now after I started cleaning down the stator cover. But to get that silicone off the cover, we're just going to use a razor blade. Get yourself a new razor blade, and you're just gently going to scrape the edge. Just gently scrape the stator cover. Whatever you do, try not to gouge the razor blade into the case, into the stator cover. Just gently wipe that razor blade along the line and get as much of that sealant off of there. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect. You just need to get the majority off of this. And then we're going to put black RVT Permatex gasket maker. That's what we're going to put on here once we get this cleaned up. You also want to check your crankcase and make sure that there's like no gobs of sealant on the crankcase, so we get a good seal with the black RVT when we put this all back together. There's nothing more embarrassing than parking your Ducati in front of the Starbucks and then coming out to having an oil leak. Let's leave that for the Harley owners. So once we've got our stator cover all cleaned up, then we're going to start putting the black gasket maker. This is black Permatex gasket maker. I also use black RVT, silicone RVT. Does a really great job of sealing up your engine. And remember, once you do this and you connect your stator cover to your bike and torque down the bolts that hold your stator cover on, let this sit overnight without putting oil in. So put your bike together, put everything back on the bike, but don't put oil in the bike and don't start the bike until tomorrow. That way you allow this gasket maker to seal and make a good bond with the crankcase so no oil leaks out of it. And I'm just putting a very light coat. All I'm really doing is taking that shiny aluminum that I just cleaned up with the razor blade. I'm just coating all that shiny aluminum with this black silicone. But I'm not putting gobs on, because the last thing you want to do is put a whole bunch of this stuff on your bike and then torque down your bolts, your stator cover bolts, and have it ooze into the crankcase. So let's not put that much on. Let's just put enough so we get an amazing seal between the stator cover and the crankcase. And for those of you who haven't seen this stuff before, Freeall is similar to WD-40, but it is amazing for rusted and bolts that you just can't get out. It's just amazing stuff when it comes to getting dirt and debris off a bolt so you can twist it out of a bike. It's called Free All. It's about $12 a can. You kind of got to hunt to find it, but it's some really good stuff. So I just wiped down any oil residue. As you're working on your bike, oil will be seeping out of the engine. So I just kind of like wiped that down and got it out of the bike. And now I'm going to put my stator cover on. You kind of have to be ambidextrous with this. You got to push your water lines out of the way and make sure you get this lined up. It's really not difficult. The stator and the magneto kind of line up. They're magnetized, so they kind of pull to each other. The hardest part is getting that shifter shaft lined up with the hole in the stator cover. But once you get the shift shaft going through the stator cover, then the stator cover will pretty much just slide right onto the bike. Now that our stator cover's on, now we're ready to start putting screws in and tightening everything down. So when you pulled your stator cover off, you noticed that the screws were all different sizes. The trick to putting them back in is each screw needs to stick out of the stator cover about a ½ inch. So if you're putting a screw into a hole and it's almost flush with the stator cover, then you know you have the screw in the wrong hole. But if you have a ½ inch of threads that are showing when you shove that screw into the hole, then you've put the screw into the proper location. And what I typically do is I'll take all the screws and I will put them in the cover as I go around the bike. And if the screw is too long or too short in the hole that I put it in, then I'll put it into a different hole. And once you've done it a few times, you'll be able to look at the position of where the screw goes into the stator cover, and you'll be able to pretty much guess which screw is going to go into that position. All right, just to save some time, I cut out me putting all the bolts into this stator cover. Now we're going to go ahead and put our cover removal plate back onto the stator cover. So again, make sure you get the torque specifications for the bolts that go into your stator cover. And then these two screws just need to be in there firm. You don't really need to torque them down. It's not a bad idea to go ahead and put some blue Loctite on these screws. You probably don't need it. The little rubber O-ring in there will put enough force against those screws to keep them into place if you tighten them down. But again, don't over tighten these. And you see that I am using an inch-pound torque wrench to put these on, but it's not really that necessary to torque down those two screws. So now we'll start buttoning up the bike and assembling it back together. So we're going to put our side stand sensor back on. Yes, you do have to remove the side stand sensor It's just one 8mm screw that holds it onto the kickstand. If you don't remove the sensor, it does get in the way of the stator coming off the bike. So that's why I find this to be a good time to go ahead and pull the side stand off. If you ride your bike a lot, if you service the chain, often the chain wax or any chain lubes that you use on the chain run down and get all up in the spring on the back of the side stand. So this is a good time to pull that off and give your side stand and the side stand bracket a good cleaning. Once that's back, you got your side stand all back together, then we can start putting our hoses, our cooling lines back on. The slave cylinder's got to go on first. So you just watched me put the cooling line on, but the slave cylinder actually has to go on underneath that cooling line. It's very important that you route your cables and your fluid lines the same way that the manufacturer had you do it. So I'm sticking that is the push rod, the clutch push rod. So I just put that into the bike. I did clean up my slave. I have another video to show you how to service your slave. But I did clean my slave when I took it all apart. I did take a Q-tip and I stuck it up in there and clean the inside of the hole where the push rod goes. I cleaned up my push rod. I made sure my slave looked like new on the inside. If you keep your slave functioning well, it won't let you down. Unfortunately, you still have to deal with that master cylinder, and I think that's how Ducati likes getting more money out of us. Because that master cylinder pretty much needs to be bled every 6 months, doesn't it? Or the clutch just never works right. So you see I'm going in a clockwise motion. I'm doing one screw a little bit and then tightening down the next screw a little bit and the next screw a little bit and the next screw a little bit. And then finally when my slave meets up with my crankcase, then I go ahead and stop with the T-bar and I use a wrench and tighten my slave down onto the bike. Again, I've never had a bike where the slave cylinder has popped off of it before, but it's a good idea to torque down those bolts that hold the slave cylinder on. So now we got a slave on, we can put our cooling lines on. When I'm putting my cooling lines on, I like to hide the screw. So anytime you put a cooling line on, all you see is the stainless steel strap. You don't see the screw. I think it makes the bike look a lot better. And most of the time, you'll be able to find that depending on whether you put the screw going up or going down, you can hide that screw back behind the tube, and it makes the bike look cleaner. So this one would be kind of a good example. you just put the clamp on the back side of the water pump. So when you got the sides off the bike, not that it really matters, but when you have the sides off the bike, you know, your bike's up on stands in the garage. If your friends come over and they look at the bike, it just makes the bike look cleaner. It looks better, I think. But that could just be me, my opinion. So we've got all our cooling hoses on. Now it's time to get our battery box into place. Maybe. Actually, I haven't even replaced the regulator yet. So at this point, we're going to replace the regulator. And it's just 2 hex head screws that holds this regulator on. And yes, it is easier to replace the regulator with the battery box off of the bike. But you can do it with the battery box still attached to the bike. Most important is to disconnect the ECU and get those ECU wires to where they're out of the way. Then you can get to those screws a lot easier. So the old regulator's off the bike, and I was kind of contemplating reusing it, but the connector is so bad that it's got to go. I'm gonna put this regulator on the shelf, and if I have to use it again, I will just splice it into a into a stator. But since I have one that looks almost brand new, I'm going to use it. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I bought these parts used, and the one test ride that I did get out of this bike, I wasn't able to really use the bike because I have a broken foot and I can't shift. But just holding the RPMs up, it keeps the same RPMs the whole time. So like I said, 14.4 volts is absolutely perfect for a motorcycle. And this thing holding it no matter what is great for me. I like a bike that'll hold the same voltage at an idle as it does in high RPMs. That means if you get stuck in traffic somewhere, you're not losing the charge on your battery just trying to keep the headlight going. So our new regulator's in place. Now I'm going to go ahead and reroute the wires for the ECU and plug the ECU back in. So in case you were wondering where your ECU is on the bike, it's right below the battery. And there's really these 2 massive connectors that plug into the ECU, which makes everything work on your Ducati. This ECU is the race ECU that comes with your Termignani exhaust when you buy it. Somewhere in a toolbox I have the original ECU that came with the 848, but this one is not it. And then right below the ECU there's a little black cable with a cover on it, and you can use that black cable to hook your laptop up to the ECU and make your changes. So here we are plugging in the stator to the new regulator. All the other, there's a black wire that comes off, a black 4-prong wire that comes off the regulator that plugs into the bike. You want to make sure you get that one, and then you want to plug your ECU or your stator into the regulator. Now, putting this battery box back onto your bike, this is going to be a serious pain in the butt. It doesn't exactly fit really well. You just got to get it lined up, and it hooks on to other crap around the oil cooler on the bottom. It's just all bad getting these screws to line up and getting them to mount right. But I have faith in you. I know you can do it. If you've made it this far, you can get your battery box back onto the bike. We're looking good at this point. Everything went back together pretty well. And like I said, it's getting the holes to line up with those nuts that are on the frame, and they kind of slide around a little bit. It takes a lot of finessing to get this battery box onto those 3 bolts. At least there's not like 6 or 7 bolts holding this battery box onto the bike. So count your blessings, it could be a lot worse. So we just want to make sure that all our wires are routed properly. My solenoid popped off of its little holders, so that's what I'm fighting with right now. So now that we got our solenoid put back into place, we can go ahead and finish tightening down our screws that hold this battery box onto the bike. Get them as tight as you can with the T-handle, and then finish them off with a little bit of torque from a wrench. So I've got a few extra wires that are dangling around. It gets chilly here, so I went ahead and put heated grips on my Ducati. So I have a power wire for heated grips. I have a power wire for my radar detector. You can't ride a motorcycle without a radar detector. My wires that are loose and floating around under the bike, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a zip tie around them just to hold them in place. Believe it or not, if you have wires that are loose and moving around, on a motorcycle, the bumping and the vibrations, even with an insulated wire, that insulation will rub up against the 2 wires or more wires, and it'll eat through that insulation. So if you can eliminate as much of that vibration as possible, easy enough by just taking a zip tie and wrapping it around a group of wires so they can't vibrate together. They're stuck together permanently for life. You don't have to worry about that insulation getting worn through. So typically a zip tie or 2, just enough to keep those wires snug and to keep them, connected to each other, is usually enough to protect them. And I have had that happen in the past where a ground wire wore through the insulation of a positive wire, and then I wonder why I'm blowing fuses. And you start taking the bike apart, and once you see the copper, the bare copper, then you absolutely know what happened. So we're almost wrapping up this job. It's time to put our battery in. So I got really lucky. The fact that the stator wire burned between the regulator and the stator cover means that it saved my battery. If you guys are using those Yasuo batteries, you know that they're anywhere from $80 to $100 for a battery. I'm using the battery for a Honda VFR. It's a larger battery than what Ducati puts on their bikes. It's got a little bit more cold cranking amps than what Ducati uses. So you might want to look at that. It fits perfectly into your battery box. You just have to pull those little rubber spacers out, and then the plastic tray that your battery rides in, just flip it around, and it'll fit. It fits. And then when hooking up your battery, always remember when you're doing a battery, do the positive first when you're hooking it up and the negative last. When you're taking the battery out, disconnect your negative first and your positive last. That'll save you from arcing or causing a fire or shorting something out. Once that ground is removed from the battery, your bike's pretty much neutral at that point. So I'm just using a Phillips screwdriver to tighten down those battery bolts, and that's good enough. It'll hold that in place for you. And then a long time ago, I guess right after I bought my Ducati, I realized how terrible the battery box is. So I drilled a small hole in the bottom of that little retainer so I could put a zip tie through. And that zip tie does a great job of, kind of holding the bottom of the battery box up. The amount of abuse that we put on our motorcycle, any support we can give to the bottom of the battery box, the better. But we're pretty much together at this point. So I hope this video was informative to you. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you never have to deal with the stator issue. Make sure that you always check that stator connector between your stator and your regulator. As long as you keep that clean and make sure that there's no corrosion in there, put some dielectric grease on those connectors inside the plastic. That'll help protect the copper from getting corroded, and you won't have this problem because this is a known issue with the Ducati connectors. You see where that connector is. It's down underneath the bike. A lot of dirt and debris, moisture gets flung up underneath there. So just inspect that. When you're doing your oil change, just look at it. If it's getting dark, the wires start to look melted, that would be a good time to cut the wires and maybe splice those wires together and get rid of the connector altogether. And that'll buy you a lot more time with your bike. So thanks for watching my video. Please watch some of my other ones.